Press.
Hello, bonjour, bienvenue à cette conférence de presse. Prendront la parole aujourd'hui le ministre de l'Immigration, Mark Miller, et le ministre de l'Emploi et des langues officielles, Randy Boissonneau. Minister will have statement for approximately 20 minutes. Then after we'll move to question. We'll first go question in the room, then online. So, Minister, the floor is yours.
Yeah, apologies. This is going to be a bit longer of an introductory speech than normal. Hello, bonjour. First, want to start by acknowledging our presence on the traditional and ceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Je tiens aussi à remercier mon collègue Randy Boissonneau à côté de moi de se joindre à nous aujourd'hui. Canada has a world-class and well-managed immigration system, but there's always more that we can do to support a successful immigration to Canada, and notably ensure that those who choose to make this their home are set up for success. As I said this fall when I tabled our levels plan for the next 3 years, immigration accounts for the vast majority of our population and the labor force growth. Grâce à l'immigration, le Canada continue d'attirer des travailleurs qualifiés dont il a besoin pour soutenir la croissance, réunir les familles, tout en maintenant nos traditions humanitaires. De nouveaux programmes dédiés aux régions rurales du nord et de l'Atlantique contribuent à la croissance de ces économies et de ces communautés, comme j'ai déjà pu notamment le constater lors de ma visite dans le nord de l'Ontario au début du mois. Et notre politique d'immigration francophone contribue à rétablir le poids démographique des communautés linguistiques minoritaires francophones à l'extérieur du Québec. At the same time, we've heard from Canadians, a wide range of civil society leaders and economists, and we've listened. Canada has seen a sharp increase in the volume of temporary residents in recent years, from a rise of international students to more foreign workers filling job vacancies to those fleeing wars and natural disasters. To be clear from the start, temporary residents enrich Canada's economic, social, and cultural fabric. Canada's future economic vibrancy depends on those we bring in today, whether we like that or not. Today, Canada's labor market is recovering, or pretty much has recovered from the pandemic, and employers are experiencing less difficulty filling jobs. And Canada, by all counts, has done a singularly good job compared to its peers in making the workplace and workforce younger. And while many temporary foreign workers are filling the needed job vacancies in critical industries like construction workers, and will be needed for the future for that, to build new homes, for early childhood educators to teach our kids, and healthcare professionals to treat patients. However, changes are needed to make the system more efficient and more sustainable. Pour comprendre quelles solutions nous devons mettre en œuvre, nous devons d'abord comprendre comment nous sommes arrivés là. Overall, temporary residence is a big umbrella term for a large number of streams and programs under IRCC management, and they can be chiefly broken down into a few categories. 42% are international students, 9% temporary foreign workers, and the temporary foreign workers program that Randy will speak about, and 44% are temporary workers under the International Mobility Program, which includes further specifics such as those postgraduate work permits, spousal work permits, students or workers, and those are temporarily visiting Canada under youth mobility agreements, as well as workers arriving through intercompany transfers or arrivals through special humanitarian pathways, including those fleeing Ukraine. And the program is composed generally of 26% postgraduate work permit holders, 9% spouses of students, 10% reciprocal youth exchange agreements, in turns allows Canadians to go work in other countries, 12% in spouses of skilled workers, and 26% arrivals, which is growing, through programs like Hewitt and other special humanitarian pathways. And then finally, 17% for intercompany transfers, trade agreements, among others. Examinons donc ceci en détail. On the workers' front, it is important to acknowledge that the pandemic left labor shortages in almost every sector of the Canadian economy. Provinces and businesses need us to bring more workers to fill these shortages, And we used all the tools at our disposal to prevent a breakdown in the economy. And we were very successful in that recovery. Employment is at 1.2 million jobs above pre-COVID numbers of February 2020. And the unemployment rate is at 5.8% of February 2024. As such, we've more than recovered all the jobs lost during COVID, and now at 138% of that number. En ce qui concerne les étudiants, entre autres, le sous-financement chronique de l'enseignement postsecondaire et des acteurs peu scrupuleux qui cherchent à tirer profit des personnes vulnérables ont entraîné une croissance exponentielle du nombre d'étudiants internationaux à travers le Canada. Ce qui a eu des répercussions significatives sur les permis de travail de troisième cycle et les permis de travail ouverts pour les étudiants, évidemment leurs conjoints. Confrontés à des niveaux sans précédent de conflits, de bouleversements économiques et politiques, de violations de droits de l'homme et de changements climatiques, nous continuons à avoir un nombre record de personnes déplacées, le recours croissant des politiques publiques temporaires pour soutenir les réponses du gouvernement à ces crises que les Canadiens attendent à juste titre contribuent à la croissance que je viens de nommer. For example, as part of our response to Ukraine, we will have close to 300,000 arrivals of Ukrainians in Canada by the end of the month. To be clear, these are important global commitments to Canadians, and Canadians should unabashedly be proud of this. At the same time, there should be an honest conversation about what the rise in international migration means for Canada as we plan ahead. Finally, we can't ignore the pressures created by the historic volume of asylum seekers in Canada, consistent with worldwide trends. And ensuring a well-resourced system that can quickly and fairly process asylum claims is critical to managing volume of temporary residents. À mesure que les conditions mondiales changent, que notre marché du travail se resserre et que le type de compétences que nous recherchons par notre future main-d'œuvre évolue, nos politiques doivent elles aussi évoluer. Nous devons être plus stratégiques dans la manière dont nous évaluons la demande des étudiants internationaux et des travailleurs étrangers temporaires que nous accueillons dans le pays. Nous devons veiller à ce que le nombre de résidents temporaires entrant dans le pays se situe à un niveau durable, tout en respectant nos engagements humanitaires et en soutenant les priorités de notre marché de travail. The question is, what have we done so far? And the good news is, because there is some, we've already taken some big stride forward on this front. And earlier this year, as you may recall, we imposed a 2-year cap for new international students to address integrity issues in that program. We also restricted eligibility for postgraduate work permits and work permits to spouses of students. Recently as well, we announced the partial visa requirement for Mexican travelers. As we continue to see the impacts of these measures over the next few years, we'll continue to adjust those approaches as well if necessary. What's next? Pour poursuivre le travail et assurer une croissance durable à l'avenir, nos programmes d'accueil des résidences temporaires doivent refléter les besoins et l'évolution des demandes du marché du travail. To that end, I've directed my department to conduct a review of existing programs that bring in temporary workers, and we're undertaking work to better align streams with labor market needs and weed out abuses in the system. I'll be working closely along my colleague, Minister Boissonneau, in those streams that fall under the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, notably. At the same time, we must ensure that robust pathways to permanent residencies for those who wish to make Canada their home in the long term and avoid the pitfalls of an economy that is built solely on temporary workers. This means not only setting targets for the number of permanent residents we welcome, but also setting targets for temporary residents. So starting this fall, for the first time, we will expand the immigration levels plan to include both temporary resident arrivals and permanent resident arrivals. The latter category is something, as you know, we are doing already. Cela permettra de renforcer l'alignement entre la planification de l'immigration, les capacités communautaires et les besoins du marché du travail et de soutenir une croissance démographique qui est, elle, prévisible. To set these targets, I'll be convening a meeting with my provincial and territorial counterparts, as well as other relevant ministers, in early May. Provinces and territories know their unique labor needs and capacity and need to assume responsibility for the people that they bring in as well. This will be an opportunity for us to come together as partners to develop plans in realigning our temporary worker streams and bringing the people we need to build homes that we are short of, for healthcare workers that we need to ensure those hospitals are properly staffed, and early childhood educators we need to ensure people can work. Nous reconnaissons pleinement que cela peut fonctionner qu'avec la contribution des provinces et des territoires et la reconnaissance qu'ils ont de leur capacité à fournir des services sociaux vitaux à des communautés en pleine croissance. On another hand, the provincial nominee program provides provinces and territories with an opportunity to address their specific economic needs while distributing the benefits of economic immigration and nominating individuals for permanent residency. As part of our efforts for temporary residents to transition to permanent residency, we'll have more domestic draws for us, for the feds, and ask provinces and territories taking part in the provincial nominee program to do the same with their allocations. This will realign our efforts and provide a pathway for those who are in the country who wish to stay and contribute to the country and to the economy. Recently, Canada's temporary resident volume has increased significantly, now reaching up to 2.5 million, or 6.2% of our population in 2023. Therefore, in our levels planning, we'll be including a target in order to reach an adequate volume of temporary residents that we can welcome. As a starting point, we are targeting a decrease in our temporary residents population to 5% over the next 3 years. This target will be, of course, finalized in the fall after consulting our provincial and territorial counterparts and as part of our annual levels planning. Au fur et à mesure que je poursuivrai ces conversations avec d'autres niveaux de gouvernement, mes collègues du cabinet, des chefs d'entreprise, des fournisseurs de services, d'établissements, je continuerai à informer les Canadiens des progrès accomplis pour faire face à cette situation fort complexe. Toutefois, s'il y a une chose à retenir de ces commentaires aujourd'hui, c'est bien celle-ci. Canada will continue to benefit from the important contributions newcomers make each and every day to us. We want every new family and resident to be set up for the success and be able to access the services that they need. Our ultimate goal is to ensure a well-managed, sustainable immigration system built on needs rather than profitability at the cost of integrity and sustainability. Thank you. Merci. Je passe maintenant la parole à mon collègue le ministre Boissonneau.
Merci, Ministre Miller. Bonjour tout le monde. We're gathered on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, and we honor them as stewards of this land since time immemorial. I'm very pleased to join Mr. Miller today. Canada's labour market has been through some rapid, often unpredictable changes over the past few years, and as Minister of Jobs, it's my first responsibility to help workers and employers navigate those challenges. And if you go back to the tail end of the pandemic, our economy saw historically low unemployment rates coupled with historically high labor shortages. And so what this did is it created an immense challenge for employers to fill key roles in their businesses, which had an effect of slowing our economic growth. And so to address that reality and to support small businesses, we introduced time-limited measures to the temporary foreign worker program, essentially to help fill those labor gaps. La pandémie a créé un immense défi pour les employeurs qui n'arrivaient pas à combler les postes clés de leur entreprise, ce qui ralentissait notre croissance économique. Afin de remédier à cette situation et pour soutenir les petites entreprises et moyennes entreprises en particulier, nous avons introduit une série de mesures dans le cadre du programme des travailleurs étrangers temporaires qui, pour une durée limitée, aidaient à combler ces pénuries de main-d'œuvre. These are workers who leave their families, travel to Canada to help take care of our loved ones, work in our businesses, pick the food that we eat, many jobs that, as a country, frankly, we rely on. And I want to make my thanks clear to these incredible workers. We are now in a different economic picture. With the gap between unemployment and job vacancies closing, a tightening labor market, some of these measures are no longer needed. We're actually seeing signs that Canadian and permanent resident workers are eager to find jobs to help make ends meet. And seeing this change, we know it's now time to ease our reliance on foreign workers and begin ramping down certain temporary measures that we put in place in 2022. So as of May 1st, the first change that we are implementing is reducing the amount of temporary foreign workers entering Canada in certain sectors. À partir du 1er mai, le premier changement que nous nous apprêtons à mettre en œuvre consiste à réduire le nombre de travailleurs étrangers temporaires qui entrent au Canada dans certains secteurs ciblés. All employers identified in the 2022 Workforce Solution Roadmap will have a reduction from 30% to 20% of their workforce come in through the temporary foreign worker program under the low-wage stream. And let me say, I don't like the name of that stream. We're going to work on changing that. That's for a future press conference. Now, the exception to what I just said is for the construction and healthcare sectors. As Minister Miller outlined, these are areas that have critical labor shortages, and with the ambition that our government has for building 2.5 million homes over the next 10 years, we need to have every single worker we can in the construction sector, and to make sure that our healthcare sector has the workers it needs. That exemption will be in place for occupations in the healthcare sector. Tous les employeurs identifiés dans le plan d'action pour les employeurs et la main-d'œuvre verront une réduction de 30% à 20% de leur main-d'œuvre admise par le biais du programme de travailleurs étrangers temporaires dans le cadre du volet de bas salaire, à l'exception des secteurs de la construction et des soins de santé. In key sectors facing labor shortages, construction and healthcare, employers will continue to be allowed to hire up to 30% of their workforce through the low-wage stream of the Temporary Foreign Worker Program until at least August 31 of this year. Les secteurs clés, encore confrontés à une pénurie de main-d'œuvre, soit la construction et le domaine de la santé, continueront d'être autorisés à embaucher jusqu'à 30% de leur main-d'œuvre sous le volet à bas salaire dans le cadre du programme des travailleurs étrangers temporaires. As the needs of our economy and workforce change, so do the measures and the policies we need to implement to ensure the greatest access and opportunities for employers and workers. Now, since these are temporary measures, we will continue to monitor and adapt to current conditions. For agriculture sector employers that meet all of the labor market impact assessment requirements, their cap exemption remains unchanged. This does not affect agriculture sector employers or their workers. Other sectors experiencing seasonal demand, like in fishing and seafood, food processing and tourism, will continue to benefit from a one-time-a-year seasonal cap exemption for work duration up to 270 days, as we introduced in 2022. The second change is that as of May 1st, the time for which an LMIA is valid, that's the Labor Market Impact Assessment, will be reduced to 6 months from the current 12 months. So, à partir du 1er mai, le deuxième changement que nous apportons est que les nouvelles demandes pour les évaluations de l'impact sur le marché du travail, les IEMT, ne seront valides que pour 6 mois au lieu de 12 mois actuels. So, to be clear, employers who are participating in the recognized employer pilot are not affected by this change. Now, the LMIA is an essential process, an essential document that a Canadian employer needs to go through and needs to get before hiring a foreign worker. The purpose of the LMIA is for the employer to show a need for a foreign worker and to confirm that no Canadian worker, permanent resident, refugee, or asylum seeker is able to do that job. And by shortening the validity period, we're going to make sure that the Temporary Foreign Worker Program is being used with the most up-to-date and accurate labor market information. En raccourcissant la période de validité des IEMT, nous nous assurons que le programme des travailleurs étrangers temporaires utilise les informations les plus récentes et les plus précises sur le marché du travail. This also encourages employers to prioritize workers that are already here, able and willing to do those roles. I hinted at it just before, but let me be really clear. The third thing we are announcing today is that as of May 1st, we are asking employers that after they consider and offer the job to Canadian citizens, permanent residents, and refugees, that they also now prioritize recruiting asylum seekers and underrepresented groups who have a valid work permit and are ready to work as an additional step before applying for an LMIA to bring a temporary foreign worker to Canada. Finalement, et pour préciser, à partir du 1er mai, nous demandons aux employeurs qu'après avoir considéré les citoyens canadiens, les résidents permanents et les réfugiés, qu'ils donnent la priorité au recrutement aux demandeurs des asiles et des groupes sous-représentés qui ont un permis de travail et qui sont prêts à travailler comme une étape supplémentaire avant de faire une demande d'IEMT pour embaucher les travailleurs étrangers temporaires. Responding to the needs of asylum claimants will mean that we have to collaborate with all orders of government. And our federal government is committed to working with our partners to determine how we can best and most efficiently support them. And I look forward to participating in the May meeting, Mark. And I will be also raising the issue with my counterparts at a labor market ministers meeting that'll take place in Winnipeg in June. So let me be clear. The Temporary Foreign Worker Program is a last resort. We expect businesses and business owners to exhaust every option and work to prioritize workers here in Canada before applying for temporary foreign workers. Employers should not use the Temporary Foreign Worker Program as a means to avoid offering competitive wages to Canadians. They need to innovate and invest in their workforce to make sure that Canada is productive and that our country continues to grow. finally, it's context. As of January 1 of this year, employers also need to review the wages of temporary foreign workers every year to make sure that they reflect the increases to prevailing wages. So what does that mean? Well, these reviews ensure that employees continue to pay temporary foreign workers at the prevailing wage level throughout their period of employment. And for the vast majority of cases, when wages are reviewed, they're increased for the workers. If not, they remain the same and they can't go down. For temporary foreign workers in this country, we are actively working to screen out any mistreatment or abuse. The security and safety of temporary foreign workers is our collective responsibility, and we must work together with industry to improve conditions, raise wages, and screen out any bad actors. Through these changes, we are ramping down our reliance on temporary foreign work program in certain sectors, making the way for Canadian and permanent residents to gain better access to good jobs. Canada's home to a strong and talented workforce, many of whom are able and ready to meet the needs and challenges of our economy. On that, it's why the federal government has invested in students and training. We've eliminated interest on the federal portion of student loans and forgiven federal student loans for doctors and nurses, a great portion of that for people working in rural communities. And we've invested hundreds of millions of dollars in apprenticeship training to grow our skilled trades workforce. We are also working with partners in provinces and territories to reduce barriers for foreign credential recognition. And these are the kind of investments that are part of the long-term solution that will help build the 21st century workforce. À titre du ministre de l'Emploi, du Développement, de la main-d'œuvre et des langues officielles, je garderai un œil attentif aux tendances du marché du travail et je n'hésiterai pas à introduire les mesures nécessaires au maintien de l'équilibre entre les besoins du marché du travail et les travailleurs disponibles au Canada. Mais aujourd'hui, nous prenons les mesures nécessaires pour combler la pénurie de main-d'œuvre, soutenir les travailleurs et permettre à l'économie canadienne de croître. So as Minister of Employment, Workforce Development, and Official Languages, I'll continue to monitor the labor market trends and introduce necessary changes that will make sure we have that balance between labor market needs and our domestic workforce. That's my job. Today, we're taking steps to ensure that critical labor gaps are filled, that we support workers, and that our economy can grow. Thank you. Merci.
Alors, les ministres sont disponibles jusqu'à 14 heures. Minister Boissonnault and Miller are available until 2. We'll start the question in the room. We'll take as much question as we are able to. Then we'll move online if we have time. Please, people who register online, just maybe raise your hand if you have a question. And we'll start with Judy Trin, CTV.
You made the comment that despite the high levels of immigration in terms of temporary permanent residents, these individuals were not getting employed. Do you have an idea, Minister Boissonnault or perhaps Minister Miller, why employers were not looking at asylum seekers or people who are here on who were temporary residents?
Well, I can start. Part of the deals that we had with the provinces. So if we take a step back, the labor market transfer agreements that we have between the federal government and the provincial government is about a $3 billion transfer that happens to the provinces every year. And that's been in place since 1996. The development of the labor force happens at the provincial level with money from the federal government so that each province can develop the talent they need in their province to respond to their labor market needs. Asylum seeker numbers were lower in the past and weren't scoped into those agreements over time. We're scoping them in now because we know that people who are coming and seeking asylum have skills and talents. And I mean, I think if you take a step back, before bringing somebody new into the country, we should exhaust all of the abilities that we have, and that's Canadians, permanent residents, refugees, and asylum seekers. And what we're announcing today is that they're going to be part of what we are going to be working with the provinces and employers to make sure happens before a labor market impact assessment gets done. We have some work to do to make sure that at the provincial level, they can access the provincial supports. And that's where the tight collaboration between Minister Miller's department and mine comes in. So this is an ongoing process, and it's why collaboration and coordination at the labor market minister's table and the Minister of Immigration table really matters.
And just to reinforce that step back, if you look at the larger pool of people, of talented people in this country, whether it's students on postgraduate work permits, whether it's asylum seekers that now have a work permit, there is a pool of talent in the country that is not matching having their skills matched with the labor needs. And instead of going abroad, first look at the pool that increases. It is continually increasing in this country that's already here. and employing them when it comes to asylum seekers, obviously as a matter of dignity, but also getting a few bucks into their pockets and getting them on the process of integration. So that's an important societal measure, but it also makes economic sense. And what we're asking our own departments, but also our provincial and territorial counterparts, is when they have the responsibility of selecting individuals to take that step further and start looking at the domestic pool that already increases. Take, for example, the very large pool of international students with postgraduate work permits that are perhaps underemployed or not employed at all. This is a young cohort of the population that has spent a number of years here, so is on the path to integration, that perhaps has a pathway to permanent residency, knowing that they're not necessarily entitled to it in the first place. So just to look at the people that are here temporarily and see if the provinces can use their numbers that they are allocated to draw on that pool of talent, so that you're not creating that carry-on ripple effect of a new entrant into the economy affecting the cost of shelter. So it just makes sense, and it's something we need to get smarter at, given the volume that's here presently, that's moved from a couple percentage points now to well over 6.2%. So what I'm announcing today is a target that reduces that 6.2% reality that we face today to 5% over the next 3 years. But I need to work with my provincial counterparts really to target that, because there can be very damaging consequences if we do this in a rather brute or rough manner without really using a set of tools that are more refined to tailor really what we are trying to attack with what we are actually doing.
When you mention that there is abuse in the system, what abuse are you talking about? And does that also imply that there is some systemic discrimination in terms of what employees are looking for, that they are overlooking refugees, asylum seekers, and going outside because of this discrimination?
So I'm going to approach your question delicately, because there's a robust compliance regime in place for the temporary foreign worker program, over 20 different criteria that employers have to are held responsible for. And during the pandemic, a lot of these assessments were done remotely, online, because people couldn't get onto into the field. But now we can. And my department has stamped that up. It's why we also have the Migrant Worker Support Program. We have a 24/7, 200 language tip line. And when temporary foreign workers arrive in this country, they go through training to understand their rights. They are given this information. They are informed very clearly about the obligations that the employer has. In some of the streams, that includes housing. That includes making sure that they have their work permit in place, that they have adequate living conditions, and that they're getting prevailing wage. There's a whole bunch of criteria. What happens is, if we find that a company is not compliant, there's a first evaluation that takes place. A fine follows that. If the behavior doesn't get better, there's another review, and I step in and give hefty fines and pull the permit for 5 to 10 years. And I have done that as minister already. And so I said this at the Senate, I'll say it here now, there's a new sheriff in town, and if employers are abusing temporary foreign workers, we're going to find you, and if you continue to do it, you're going to have your temporary foreign worker permit pulled. Because every single worker that comes to this country deserves to be treated with dignity. And I think it's also important to help Canadians understand that in the case of our deal with Mexico, which represents over 50% of our seasonal agricultural worker program, that program has been in place with the government of Mexico for 50 years. 4 years less than I've been alive. And it has grown over time at the request of the Mexican government, and it is a program that works. We have the Jamaican government that also provides temporary foreign workers to the country, and some of these workers have come to Canada for, in some cases, decades. And so the program works. My job, because look, I ran against this part of the temporary foreign worker program in 2015 because I didn't think Stephen Harper's government was doing a good job with it. Our government has put in a whole bunch of measures. We support workers. There are pathways to permanent residency now, and we are going to continue to take steps to make sure that workers are protected. And money goes to organizations like Mosaic in Vancouver and other migrant supporting entities to make sure that the workers' rights are protected. Now, your other question was, are they not scoping in people from disadvantaged groups? That's what was taking place. And I think some people in the low wage stream, that's where we want to go. But in the agriculture stream, what I'm announcing today doesn't apply there. I can tell you that the work that's been done in the seasonal agricultural worker program, the reason that it's existed for so long is because over time, every time employers would go to the Canadian market to say, do you want to pick blueberries? Do you want to do fish processing? Do you want to do the hard labor of food processing in this country? The answer was Canadians weren't taking those jobs. And that's why we have the agricultural program that's been in place for a long time.
Michel Sabat, La Presse canadienne.
Monsieur Miller, vous avez récemment annoncé des visas pour les Mexicains. Comptez-vous imposer des visas pour d'autres pays?
J'ai dit lors de mon point de presse pour annoncer la réimposition de l'ETA+, sur le Mexique, qu'il y avait d'autres mesures à prendre, effectivement. Le défi auquel on fait face, c'est que les autres pays qui sont sources de demandeurs d'asile ont déjà le prérequis d'avoir un visa avant d'entrer au pays. Donc, c'est encore une question de regarder comment ce visa se fait accorder. Travailler avec les pays en question, là où il y a des abus, pour vraiment enrayer à la source les gens qui utilisent et abusent de cet accord de visa, mais c'est plus difficile. Réimposer un visa, ça n'a pas été facile, ça a pris beaucoup de travail, mais de peaufiner le processus d'accord d'un visa avec un pays avec lequel on peut avoir des accords de libre-échange, etc., c'est plus difficile. Donc, le travail se fait. Il ne va pas avoir nécessairement le même résultat immédiat que la réimposition du visa sur le Mexique. On a déjà vu une diminution, c'est tôt, là, mais on a vu une diminution très importante des demandeurs d'asile suite à la réimposition du visa avec le Mexique. Donc, pour l'instant, j'hésite à dire que c'est un succès, mais on voit des beaux résultats. Je pense qu'il faut regarder les mesures qui existent à l'intérieur de notre département pour essayer d'enrayer le flux illégitime, irrégulier, sans vraiment affecter les droits des personnes qui fuient la guerre. Donc, c'est un équilibre, puis c'est un équilibre très délicat.
Merci. Si vous pouvez me préciser dans la prochaine réponse à quel pays vous faites référence exactement. Puis, d'autre part, je vous écoute, puis M. Boissonneau l'a abordé, mais surtout, ça a été surtout abordé en anglais. Donc, avez-vous l'impression que les employeurs embauchent des travailleurs étrangers pour payer des salaires moins élevés que des Canadiens, un peu comme du cheap labor? Puis en même temps, est-ce que vous ne craignez pas les conséquences sur la croissance économique?
Bien, pour répondre à la question que vous m'avez posée suite à ma dernière réponse, vous avez juste à regarder le top 20 des pays qui sont sources de demandeurs d'asile pour voir de quel pays je parle. Oui, c'est clair que dans certains secteurs, l'utilisation de travailleurs temporaires est utilisée pour la suppression de salaire. Il ne faut pas exagérer le problème non plus. Puis il ne faut pas exagérer non plus les défis auxquels vont faire face les entrepreneurs qui dépendent de ces gens-là. Et donc, c'est pour ça que l'annonce que je fais, c'est-à-dire de réduire le nombre de gens qui sont ici de façon temporaire de 20 %, ça doit venir de plusieurs sources. D'abord, demander aux provinces de donner la résidence permanente à certains gens qui sont là de façon temporaire. C'est du gros bon sens. Les gens ont déjà des logements, je présume. Et donc, au lieu d'aller à l'étranger, mais aussi de faire des rectifications dans les programmes, puis il y a multiples programmes qui sont gérés par mon département, évidemment celui de M. Boissonneau.
Mary Wolfe, Globe and Mail.
Thanks. I wanted to ask about the 5% target that you're temporarily imposing. And the impact that might have on humanitarian programs and asylum. Clearly, these things are not predictable. Wars, earthquakes and such that drive people to leave their homes. And I wondered if you are leaving that open or if those streams will be effectively capped.
No, I mean, we always have to have a managed intake, Mary, but there are circumstances where it would be unconscionable to do that. For example, with respect to Ukraine and the global efforts that we deployed with partner countries to welcome Ukrainians. As I mentioned, there'll be 300,000 here by the end of this or next month, so not an insignificant amount. No one would ask them to return during these conditions, and certainly shit could hit the fan in Ukraine in the next months as well if Russia were to continue its war of aggression in the way that it has, which would necessitate further international outreaches and support. And that's just clear. I don't think any Canadians would forgive us for not having that level of outreach and support for our Ukrainian partners. At the same time, we can't deny the impact that 300,000 people and other humanitarian measures, including postgraduate work performed by students and international students, has had as an impact. So it's a delicate balance. I think what we're asking, and I think it makes sense, is there are two ways to control the number of temporary residents in this country. It is input and output. In terms of the input, there are things we control and things we don't control. And in terms of output, that is where provinces and Canada can select people to become permanent residents and look for more domestic draws, which actually makes sense because you're not taking away, you're not affecting the cost of shelter as much as you would with a new entrant to the economy, and you're actually being more efficient in the way you are doing you are doing the levels. For example, we currently are at as a target for this year, well over 480,000 permanent residents. Do all those people come from abroad? The answer is no, resoundingly, but perhaps we need to look in more depth at the domestic ways in which we draw people to permanent residency, and I think that makes eminent sense because those people have a beginning of integration in this country, have a job, have a house, and it's something that attacks the affordability challenge right on by making sure that we are being reasonable in the levels of temporary foreign work that we have and temporary residence in this country. I mentioned during my levels plan that Canada, like many other countries, has become addicted to temporary foreign workers, but it isn't. It is a more complex story than simply saying that. And the example of our humanitarian pathways is just one.
Minister Boissonnaud, I wanted to ask about the LMIA program. You're reducing from 12 months to 6 months, and you also talked about wanting to stamp out abuse in the system. Mm-hmm. Is part of your motivation to try and stop fraud and the sale of LMIAs, which I think your department is aware of? And could you please explain whether there are any other measures that you're putting in place to try and stop this?
So on the issue that you raised about LMIA fraud, I've tasked my department to look into this in depth. I don't want anybody putting up a job that then is used to lure somebody here to take in an LMIA that's in the system. That's not what it's designed for. But if we find and actually locate people are doing that, then the authorities will get involved. And if I can find them with my own measures, we will absolutely do that. Labor market impact assessments are here as a way to make sure that Canadians, permanent residents, refugees, and now asylum seekers don't want a job that a particular employer is advertising for. And this, to Mark's point, this has a real effect in rural and remote Canada, right? Like I'm the minister for Alberta. We're talking about some places where these are the only inn or the only restaurant in a 50 or 100 mile radius. So what happens if we adjust the system too quickly and the only restaurant or the only auberge, the only inn in the area, or the only employer in the area has to shut down because they can't get enough work? That has a cascading effect then on the whole ecosystem. So we're being very careful about that. I'm happy to come back to you as I have more answers on the LMIA fraud piece, but I guess this is where, we've been hinting at it, but here's the wicked problem. We got 650,000 vacancies in the labor market right now, and 1.2 million Canadians that want to go to work. 1.2 million Canadians out of work and a 650,000 vacancy. So why is that? There's an issue of skills mismatch, geography mismatch. People are not actually reaching out to Indigenous people, to persons with disabilities, to women, to racialized women, to us LGBTQI people. There is a workforce in this country that employers are simply not doing everything they can to go find. And I do not want, the government does not want an easy lever to bring a foreign worker in here that will have, in this low wage stream, lower wages. So there's a whole ecosystem here that we're working on. And just to give you some context, 1% of the Canadian labor force comes in through the temporary foreign worker program. And of that, 25% is in this low wage stream. So what we're talking about is reducing the number of temporary foreign workers that can come in through the temporary foreign worker program, because we're going to reduce the size of the workforce that can be from a temporary foreign worker from 30% to 20% in sectors other than construction and healthcare.
Sandrine du Devoir.
Oui, bonjour. Monsieur Miller, vous dites que vous allez rencontrer les provinces au mois de mai, mais est-ce que vous en avez déjà parlé avec elles de ce nouveau programme-là ou est-ce qu'elles l'apprennent en même temps que nous aujourd'hui? Savez-vous si elles sont d'accord et avez-vous peur que ça bloque?
Ben, d'un, j'ai évidemment, en ce qui a trait à ma province, le Québec, on a entendu sur la place publique, évidemment, le désir de vouloir réduire le nombre de gens qui sont au Québec de façon temporaire. Donc, c'est bien reçu, bien compris. Évidemment, en Ontario, les gens le comprennent bien. On va en parler. C'est une annonce qu'on fait aujourd'hui suite au constat qu'on fait et que les économistes ont fait quant au niveau de gens qui sont de façon temporaire, la façon dont ça attaque et affecte l'abordabilité. Donc, ce qu'on fixe aujourd'hui, c'est une cible, mais c'est une cible qui sera à gérer avec les provinces en assumant leurs responsabilités. Les gens qui sont ici, évidemment, de façon temporaire, c'est pour travailler dans les économies provinciales. Évidemment, il y a une question de responsabilisation et c'est de quoi les États généraux qu'on a convoqués pour le mois, dans le mois et demi à suivre. C'est quelque chose, ça va être la matière de cette discussion avec bien d'autres, évidemment, l'impact des demandeurs d'asile, comment bien fixer nos niveaux en concertation avec les provinces, ce qu'on fait déjà. Et pour ce qui est du Québec, je rencontre notamment la ministre Fréchette la semaine prochaine.
Pour justement la manière dont ça va s'appliquer au Québec, est-ce que vous comptez toucher au traitement simplifié?
Bien, ça sera à décider avec Québec. On va leur en parler. C'est clair que, surtout dans les enjeux qui ont été soulignés par le ministre Boissonnault, il y a des impacts qui se font sentir au Québec. Le Québec n'est pas un exemple de certaines tendances qui existent à travers le pays. Et donc, il va falloir s'en parler. Là, c'est une question, évidemment, la bonne volonté de vouloir réduire le nombre de gens qui sont ici de façon temporaire. Il y a une question de responsabilisation. En ce qui a trait à la façon dont on le fait, est-ce qu'on accepte plus de gens ici de façon permanente? Est-ce qu'on embauche des gens qui sont déjà ici? Est-ce que ces gens-là vont être embauchés de façon temporaire aussi ou d'autres parties de la province? Là, je spécule, mais c'est clair qu'il va y avoir le besoin d'avoir les mêmes cartes sur la table avec Québec pour qu'on puisse prendre des bonnes décisions politiques ensemble.
Tom Perry, CBC News.
Thanks. Minister Miller, I'd like to ask you about the 5% target. How did you come to that figure? How did you come to 5%? And you referred to it, I think, as a starting point. So is your goal to drive those numbers even lower over time?
Yeah, and it is because of all the issues that I highlighted and the challenges that we face, depending on how you tweak the system and the impacts that it can have. We thought 5% was reasonable. We've looked at a number of trends. This is not a historical load, driving it down by 19%, but it is something that has to be done well. If you look in those large categories, there are ones that we don't control. For example, the humanitarian categories. We are just now starting to get some control over the student category, which is a very large part of that, but it is also a part that generates billions and billions of dollars for provincial economies, in particular Ontario and BC. So we need to see those results stick first, but we need to have a larger discussion on that. So I think it's a reasonable goal. I think it's relatively ambitious, but it's a target that we'll have to crystallize over the next 3 years. How we do it is something that will be the subject of discussion in our meetings with the provinces in the next month.
I would like to just get if your goal is to drive that number lower, but I'd also like to ask you as well, if I could, about how much housing is driving the need for or this change.
Well, certainly the cost of shelter, and that in this case is often the rental market. It'll be an opportunity to be able to talk about that, because if people, I guess the point is we make to provinces is if you want to bring in all these people on a temporary basis, there's got to be better planning. I mean, we do publish levels every 3 years of permanent residency. It doesn't comprise temporary residence, but it's not as if provinces look at those levels with bated breath and then start start building houses as a result of anything that's announced, or decreasing depending on what levels we announce. There are political decisions, and they are not necessarily matched with what we would suggest is the most efficacious way of doing things, like building a house or planning for the next 3 years. Those things don't necessarily get built. It has driven the need for the federal government to get involved, whether that's student housing, whether that's low-income housing, affordable housing. It takes different forms, but the whole point of this is we're in this together. And when it comes to immigration, it is a shared responsibility, some provinces having more responsibility than others. But that comes with duties as well. And I think that will be, in those discussions, when provinces tell us we need X amount of people for our economy, we also have to have a discussion about X, Y, or Z needs in other areas, including housing, but including health services, including education, where we've seen some strains on the system. We talk a lot about the need for teachers in Quebec. Certainly there are, but that exists in Ontario as well, for example.
Mélanie Marquis, La Presse.
Bonjour, M. Miller. Toujours sur la cible de 5 si je comprends bien, vous allez avoir le sommet au mois de mai. Ça va être finalisé quelque part à l'automne. Pourquoi est-ce que vous l'annoncez aujourd'hui, avant les consultations, et non pas à l'automne?
Mais c'est parce qu'il va falloir se préparer. Hein? C'est pas une question de ministre qui se présente au podium pour faire des annonces. Ça va prendre des sous-ministres, des fonctionnaires pour pouvoir travailler ensemble pour avoir des états généraux, un sommet qui va être productif. Très franchement, les sommets où les gens font des énoncés et puis rentrent chez eux en se donnant une tape sur le dos, là, ça me tente pas. Je veux quelque chose de productif. Je veux qu'on puisse sortir nos discussions avec mes collègues des provinces avec des objectifs, des résultats, peut-être des points à suivre. Et puis dans le Québec, en ce qui a trait au Québec, sous l'accord Canada-Québec, peut-être une discussion aussi à part pour pouvoir régler nos enjeux qui sont spécifiques au Québec. Et donc, ça prend une certaine préparation, ça prend des objectifs, ça prend un énoncé du gouvernement fédéral quant à nos objectifs, mais la façon de le faire, puis la responsabilisation des provinces et du fédéral en même temps, ça va être à discuter, puis pas nécessairement sur la place publique. Il y a beaucoup de programmes dans l'IRCC, il y a beaucoup de programmes dans les gouvernements provinciaux. Ceux qui sont les plus efficaces, je pense qu'on devrait les appuyer, puis ceux qui sont moins productifs, peut-être les montrer la porte. Donc, c'est une question de coordination, et c'est un peu ça qu'on vise. Donc, c'est bien de l'annoncer d'avance, c'est bien d'annoncer des objectifs, mais je pense que les Canadiens et les Québécois veulent des résultats concrets.
Merci. Vous, en lien avec les visas mexicaines dont Michel parlait, vous avez vu ce qui est arrivé à l'entreprise d'usine de transformation de crevettes à Matane. Là, on approche de l'ouverture de la pêche au crabe. Où en est-on dans le dossier des travailleurs mexicains qui devaient arriver, mais là, qui sont bloqués? Pouvez-vous nous fournir une mise à jour?
Mais il y a beaucoup de détails. On savait avec notre annonce le 29 février qu'il y aurait des conséquences. Ce qu'on a vite vu, c'est que dans cette industrie en particulier, il y avait une certaine manie qui est une zone assez grise, pas nécessairement la meilleure façon de procéder, où les gens se pointaient à la frontière puis réclamaient leur visa. Donc, avec la réimposition du visa mexicain, c'est plus une porte d'entrée qui peut se faire. Donc, les industries, et évidemment, le gouvernement du Canada a dû et doit s'ajuster. Présentement, au Mexique, on est en train de travailler avec le gouvernement mexicain notamment, mais avec les travailleurs potentiels pour s'assurer qu'il n'y ait pas de délai dans leur traitement. Mais ça a pris une certaine logistique puis un réajustement qu'on fait maintenant, puis on y met les bouchées doubles. En ce qui a trait à la... On l'espère bien. Selon mes estimations, puis j'aime pas dire quelque chose qui n'est pas encore complètement ficelé parce qu'on y travaille encore, on pense qu'au moins 80% des gens pourront arriver. Puis en ce qui a trait aussi à l'usine de crevettes, je sais qu'il y a beaucoup qui a été dit, mais on a on était prêt. Il y avait même 37, je pense, des 40 visas qui étaient déjà accordés. Donc, leur fermeture relève d'autres choses. Mais c'est clair que il y a pu avoir un blâme qui s'est porté contre cette réimposition, mais je pense que c'est faux parce que j'ai vu notre équipe travailler dessus, puis l'accord de visa, on en avait fait au moins 90%. Donc, les travailleurs, à ma meilleure connaissance, étaient prêts à venir. Il reste que le problème avec l'ouverture de la saison de crabe se fait attendre dans les jours à suivre. On y travaille, mais selon ce que j'ai sous les yeux, au moins 80%, même j'espère 100% des gens pourront arriver.
Laura Thompson, Canadian Press.
Thanks, ministers. Would it be more accurate to call these targets a cap? And what does that mean in practical terms, in terms of the number of applications you're going to process? So you're going to stop processing applications after you reach a certain number?
Now, since they go into our permanent planning, first of all, it's an important statistical tool. One of the criticisms that we got during the last strategic review we did, but also the levels plan, which is a statutory requirement, was that it didn't fully account for the temporary space. That is an increasing number. In the past, that probably wasn't as much of a concern as it is today. So we're integrating that. Anytime you put a number in those plans, they become, for public servants, a soft cap. The reality is that, I don't want to speak before I'm able to have a really good conversation with provinces and our teams to work together to make sure that we actually can affect that. There's a lot of things that are not within our control. I've mentioned a lot of times the humanitarian path, but the impact of how many students will come in. We didn't cap all the streams, so people could still play games, and we haven't capped absolutely everything. It's not something we've done as a practice in the past, and it hasn't impacted us. But now we are seeing the need to ramp things down. So it is possible that in certain areas we would limit applications. We wouldn't exclude that. But I wouldn't, by all means, go out and say we're going to cap all streams, because it's, one, functionally impossible in some senses, and two, perhaps not something that provinces will be ready to accept. But if they don't, they need to tell us and take responsibility for it.
On temporary foreign workers, why set a target rather than sort of strengthen the the assessment process so that it's based more on demand rather than setting a target ahead of time?
So we're doing both. And to your original question, it's a cap. So what we're saying is, for the low-wage stream, if you're not in the exempted sector, you can't have any more than 20% of your workforce coming in from the TFW stream. So that's one piece. What we're working on through the Migrant Worker Support Program are more supports to migrant workers in place, and also making sure that, for example, it's a conversation that Minister Miller and I have on a regular basis, and making sure that in the agriculture sector that there are, sectoral-based permits, so that a worker isn't tied down to one employer, right? It's not an open work permit to go work in any sector, but that it's a sectoral work permit. That's really important, and those are ongoing conversations, and I like that from a worker protection perspective. So those are conversations we have with our international partners, because it has an impact on who they recruit to come to Canada as well. But more worker protections, a cap of 20% for non-exempted sectors, and employers have to look at all of the underrepresented groups I mentioned, plus Canadian residents, temporary Canadian residents, permanent residents, so Canadian citizens, permanent residents, refugees, and asylum seekers. Only then are they going to be able to apply for that LMIA.
Pascal Vachon.
Oui, bonjour. Ma question pour le ministre Miller. En janvier, vous avez annoncé le plafond des étudiants étrangers. C'est une réduction de 35 %. Avec l'annonce d'aujourd'hui, bien entendu, sont inclus. Vous dites que 5 % c'est un objectif, ça pourrait aller plus haut par l'avenir. Est-ce qu'on peut en comprendre que vous pourriez aller encore plus loin sur les étudiants étrangers puis réduire encore plus que, par exemple, le plafond, là, je pense, c'est 360 000 en 2024? Est-ce qu'on peut en penser que dans les prochaines années, ça pourrait être encore plus beau au pays?
Mais la réponse est oui. J'attends la réponse des provinces. Évidemment, ils ont leur allocation à faire pour chaque institution sur laquelle ils ont la pleine juridiction. C'est clair qu'il y a des catégories, c'est-à-dire dans la catégorie de la maîtrise, bac professionnel et doctorat, où il n'y a pas de maximum. Donc, c'est pas normalement un endroit où il y a beaucoup de croissance, mais on ne sait jamais. Il y a ce concept de faux MBA que certaines institutions commencent à planifier. Donc, il va y avoir peut-être lieu d'enrayer cette tendance, ainsi que le programme secondaire, primaire-secondaire, qui est pas sujet à un maximum. Il y a certaines provinces où le programme secondaire, je dirais, il y a une mauvaise tendance en termes de recrutement d'étudiants internationaux. Donc, c'est toujours ouvert sur ces plans-là. Et puis, sur ceux où j'ai établi un maximum par province, c'est à suivre. J'hésite à répondre de façon concrète pour l'instant parce que j'attends la rétroaction puis l'imposition des provinces par institution pour voir comment je vais réagir. Donc, encore une fois, c'est une question de responsabilisation, puis de s'assurer que les gens qui ont juridiction sur ces champs de compétences les exercent de façon responsable. Puis dans le cas de l'Ontario, c'est là, je pense, où il y a le gros du volume, puis on attend toujours. Mais j'ai espoir, là. Je ne suis pas négatif dans mes propos, mais j'ai espoir, mais j'attends pour vérifier, quitte à prendre les prochaines décisions. Ce sera, en termes d'échéancier, je ne pense pas prendre plus de décisions, à moins qu'il y ait des gros abus avant l'automne.
Puis, peut-être une question plus sur les chiffres, mais selon les dernières données, il y a à peu près 2,5 millions d'immigrants temporaires au Canada. Là, vous parlez d'un objectif de 5 puis vous nous situez, là, 5 de 2,5, c'est alentour de 125 000. Est-ce que c'est 5 des nouveaux immigrants temporaires? Est-ce que ça va être 125 000 de moins? Puis vous nous situez, ça serait quoi votre objectif d'immigrants temporaires par année? Je sais que vous voulez l'annoncer à l'automne, mais par rapport à la cible de 5 là, sur des chiffres plus concrets, là.
Bien, ce serait... maintenant, on peut penser à une réduction d'à peu près 19 de ce qui est des gens qui sont là aujourd'hui. Là, le 6 c'est 6 de la population en 2023. Alors, vous pouvez faire le calcul, puis ensuite soustraire 20 Comment y procéder, évidemment, ça va être la discussion qu'on va avoir en mai.
Do you have time for a very last question from Mark Renzi from Toronto Star?
Just following up on a question earlier about how this could affect how much humanitarian refugees we let in. The war in Gaza there's over 1 million refugees. Is this going to account at all for how many we're able to let in here after the war?
I think the big answer is no, given the numbers in question. But again, these are discussions that have geopolitical consequences, and we are now struggling to get people out of Gaza with limited success, and so that is the focus. But I think for purposes of what you're going to write, in particularly when it comes to Gaza, I would say the answer to that is no. There is an important aspect to this, which is making the asylum system in Canada more effective. And the capacity of our asylum system is strained right now. That's a function of financial resources, physical resources, and the ability of people to get proper due process within a time frame that Canadians would find acceptable. That has been challenged, and in order to effect these changes, getting people from the temporary status that they have as seeking asylum to either the adjudication, whether they get it or not. If they are not, they would go through processes to be removed from the country. But if they do, go from protected person, which is still quantified as someone that is here temporarily, to permanent residence. And I think this is a challenge that we have with the system because of the lag time on that. So some of the lag time and some of the numbers that we are seeing are also the result of that historic number of asylum seekers that find their way to Canada through no efforts that Canada's made. They will cross through the border or come through at point of entry, usually an airport. And that processing time has also helped balloon that, and that's something that we'll have to work on as well. Right now, the capacity is really under strain given the numbers that we've seen. The reimposition of the Mexican visa will help that, as well as some of the other measures that we are looking to take. But again, Canada, like other countries, is not immune to the global flow of migration that we're seeing that is at historical highs.
And just to follow up, yesterday you said that you thought, in response to the passage of the NDP motion, it might make it harder for people trying to get from Gaza to Canada. Could you just clarify what you meant by that? Have you received any indication at all from the Israeli government, which you said is watching whatever we're doing? Have you received any indication from them at all that they would make it harder for people to do that?
No, I think what I made clear was that the motion in and of itself is a reflection of the position of the government of Canada, or in this case, formerly the Parliament of Canada, and the message that that sends has a consequence, and I think we can't be naive to that. Countries take decisions based on those declarations, whether they're non-binding or not, and that's just the reality of and particularly so in such a heated situation and a humanitarian catastrophe. We are undertaking intense diplomatic efforts to advocate for hundreds of people that are currently on a list, and so I won't speak further on that, principally out of the concern for the safety of the people on that list that we want to get out. Again, my point when I spoke about that motion, and motion that however well-meaning and however well-principled it was, I stood up and voted for it, can and potentially will have consequences.
Merci. C'est ce qui conclut cette conférence de presse. Merci pour